in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at All Voices. Today, I am super excited to welcome two guests onto our show today. We're welcoming Jabulile Dayton, Chief People and Inclusion Officer, and Lesley Alegría, Recruiting and People Operations Consultant and Career Coach. Thank you both so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourselves, including your pronouns, and if either of you remember the answers to the question, what do you want to be when you grow up, when you were younger? I would love to know that as well.
Totally. Thank you so much, Christina. We really appreciate how thoughtfully you've crafted this platform for people like us. And I always hate doing introductions for myself, but my name is Jabulile Dayton, she, her. I have my own consulting business called Jabu HR. Clearly was not very imaginative with the name, but it works. And we help currently about 8 different client companies with hiring, HR, DEI strategies, just building companies from scratch. So we typically work with really small startups, anywhere from 0 to 100. And we partner with the C-level folks and the founders to create the company of their dreams. Lesley and I are lucky to work together, so I'll let her do her thing. But when I was a kid, this will date me, but I wanted to be Wonder Woman. And Wonder Woman had the cartoon had this see-through jet situation. So like you would just see her sitting, flying through the air, and then she had the little like arm things, and I was just like smitten. So that's me, Lesley.
I love it. I'm like, that's such a hard act to follow. That's amazing. My name's Lesley. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a recruiting HR people ops consultant. And I'm so lucky I get to work with Jabu to really serve early stage startups as they're building out their recruiting infrastructure, their people ops infrastructure, and ensuring that they're building an inclusive company from the get-go. I'm also a career coach, and so I get to work with folks who are looking to transition into tech, and specifically for folks who are first generation college grads and looking to get into the workforce, and all the navigating that has to happen to be able to land that first role and be able to navigate promotions, transitions, et cetera, et cetera. And how I used to answer what I wanted to be when I grew up. It sounds a little cliche, but I always wanted to be a teacher. And I was very fortunate that once I graduated from Cornell, I went into the classroom. So I did teach. I was a pre-K teacher for 2 years through Teach for America and really enjoyed my time. But when I was younger, I promise you, I had a whiteboard and everything in my bedroom. And I have a younger sister. So I would play school and she was my only student. And we would literally be whiteboarding all the time. So in a way, I'm like, okay, that also seems a little techie with the whiteboarding. So very fortunate that I did get to live out that dream and apply it to the work that I do now.
I love that. I think both answers are really, really great. I remember also playing school and being the teacher and really loving that. Huge Marvel person and just superheroes in general. So that personally resonates with me. And when we're talking about kind of the work that you're both doing, creating these employers of choice where people feel like they are heard, seen, understood, like they belong and can do their best work. I have so many questions about this, but I would love to ask, how do you think both of your personal journeys have really led you both to work together?
Well, Lesley and I are both first gen, and I think that influences a lot of the work that we do, how we support people, what we think is important. And obviously, we're both folks of color, and that makes a huge impact also. I think we listen differently to people, but I actually kind of hustled, always be recruiting, but Lesley was, I was hiring my director of recruiting and inclusion, Edgardo, who's amazing. And we were working together at Abstract, and he gave Lesley as a reference. And so when I spoke with her, I immediately knew that I wanted her on my team. So I started pitching to her on that call while she was like trying to give a reference. And that kind of speaks to a lot of the energy that we have between us as we work with clients. We have other consultants that join us in that work, but we have a lot of fun doing what we do, and we just recognize and respect each other's work a lot.
Yeah, it's also so funny because on the flip side, I remember being on that call. And for me, it's always been like, always be interviewing. So always be recruiting, but always be interviewing, always be pitching yourself. And I remember distinctly on that call, I was like, so when are you going to hire me? Because let me tell you all the things that I can do with you. And she joked, she's like, oh, I'll come back around. And I mean, fast forward a few years, here we are, but feel very fortunate about that call. And honestly, I do think it has a lot to do with just perspective around always seeing opportunities where we can partner together and knowing that our differences make us all much stronger to be able to support our different clients. So always thinking about the mixture of making sure that we're supporting clients with mindset coaching and supporting them through these big changes that are happening with their companies and in their roles, et cetera. But also looking at the operation side. All right, what are some tangible tools that you can use to make sure that you're successful as you're navigating a lot of changes at your company? So it's always really fun to be able to put our heads together.
Yeah, absolutely. Putting together that holistic strategy is really important, setting up goals, and then tangibly, how do we really create an equitable workplace? How do we operationalize equity? So people are thinking about how they can make more inclusive practices on their kind of day-to-day job and processes as well. And one of the key points that a lot of people are talking about, which is really great, is in that kind of talent pipeline, in inclusive recruiting. I would love to know what is the difference between quote unquote good inclusive recruiting and great inclusive recruiting, especially for first gen hires, people of color, and historically underrepresented folks as well.
Yeah, great question, Christina. There's a huge difference. So, good inclusive hiring is that we talk about it, we know how to say all the words correctly, we know how to identify the folks that are underrepresented, but we may or may not hire them. And along with that goes with, something that CEOs need to learn. It's like, it's not just the intention to hire inclusively. Like, is your company going to be able to be supportive and a safe place for people once they're brought in? So there's a twofold, parallel process that has to happen at the same time. You need to be building out your company in such a way that someone like me wants to work there and wants to work with you. And then you actually need to include people that are underrepresented in your interview process, both as interviewers and interviewees, obviously. So you need to do more outreach, and that's more expensive. There's a lot more sort of complexities to that a typical recruiter in Silicon Valley may or may not have the skills to navigate, and that's where we come in to help. But I would also say the best type of process that you have is one where those underrepresented folks actually get hired, get supported, get promoted, get compensated properly. We work with CEOs who will have, and we just had this happen actually, and our CEO actually ended up paying someone almost $100K more than what they asked for because they were asking for what was under market for their role and experience. So we're working with those kind of people to develop the integrity, the ethics that all need to also live in your inclusive hiring process, or in any hiring process. Every hiring process should be inclusive. But Lesley, is there anything that I missed that you want to add?
Yeah, I think all of that, and just ensuring that you are consistent in your processes and always learning from them. Because I've also learned, as folks are getting their processes set up, they believe it's like, all right, set it and forget it kind of system. And it really can't be like that. You always have to be auditing yourself, evaluating, is this process working? I'm a big fan of reviewing all the different data that you're collecting as you're recruiting, as you're hiring, figuring out, all right, what are the EEOC demographics that are coming through our pipeline? What does our sourcing strategy look like? Do we have a sourcing strategy? Right? Always checking in throughout the process and trying to improve, and always being open to learning. I think that's a huge piece of all of this, because we're dealing with humans, and humans are complex, and you're never going to find like a one size fits all for everybody. But if you're continuously learning and you're continuously reviewing the data, reviewing the anecdotal data that you're also collecting just from your candidate feedback, your hiring manager feedback, et cetera, it's also going to be really helpful as you're putting together a process that's going to help others be seen. Because that's the other aspect of all of this from a candidate perspective. And I feel like as a career coach, I've been able to really gather a lot of insights on how folks interpret the interview process from the candidate side. And a good interview or recruiting process, you'll have your candidate walk and be like, wow, like that wasn't terrible. I feel good. I feel like I know what the role is. I feel like how, who the hiring manager is. I have an understanding of how I'm going to be supported. A great recruiting process, the candidate will walk away and say, wow, I cannot wait to work here. I feel like this is the opportunity that's going to accelerate my career. This is the place where I feel like I can actually take a breath and be myself. And that means everything. And that shift can happen if you have an organized interview process. If internally you're reviewing how you can make it better, you're getting to know your candidates as humans, not just as another applicant going through the process, and you're continuously improving. And that's a really big part of the whole puzzle around inclusive recruiting.
Yeah, for sure.
I love that. Continuous learning is so important. How can we consistently redesign processes to make sure that everybody is included? How are we mitigating bias? And then, Jabu, to your point as well, we are saying all these things around how we are inclusive, how we value you. Do our actions align with that once you are at the organization as well? Because you can tell pretty quickly if you are sold something that is not actually true once you get to an organization too. Again, asking yourselves these big questions, Lesley, as you were talking about too, and self-auditing. So once folks are at the organization, a lot of conversations are happening, and it's in the title of our show too, around company culture, and it's constantly changing as people are shifting towards remote work and more people are joining teams across different geographies. But from your experiences, what are qualitative and quantitative ways we can really measure company culture, keep a pulse check on what's happening, and again, intentionally build this really equitable system?
Lesley, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, I'm like, ooh, I have ideas. I'll jump in. I love talking about this. I mean, from like the qualitative piece, I'll give you some like really concrete strategies. The one that I always go to, especially when we're onboarding new clients and we always have milestone and check-in points, right, is a listening tour. And I cannot stress that enough. And it almost goes back to the same idea around the set it and forget it. When folks enter a company, they're really excited to get to know people. And then you slowly start getting a little bit siloed. You start getting heads down in your projects. And especially for managers, it's actually really important that you don't default to that you actually go on your listening tour on a continuous basis and get to know the employees that you're supporting, the employees that you're working with. And especially if you're at the director level or senior manager level, or you're managing a really big team, having those pulse checks. Now, some of those might be your weekly one-on-ones that you're having with your direct reports, but other times you might have cross-functional partners or people that you're working with from different teams that you might not necessarily be responsible for managing, but the way that they work with your team will influence culture. And you won't necessarily know who they are or what that culture looks like unless you're in that Zoom room now, because we're all remote. And the best way to do that, if you're not in those meetings, those project meetings or working meetings, is to have one-on-ones. Now, folks typically are like, oh, Lesley, really? I have 5 million meetings. They're all back to back. I barely have time to go to the bathroom. You want me to meet with more people? But if you set it up in a way where you're meeting with people on a bi-weekly basis, so every 2 weeks, or you have a monthly catch up with someone from another department that you work closely with, but maybe not on a very regular and like frequent basis, you'll be able to get to know them, get to know what they're working on, get to know their style. And all of those anecdotal pieces end up amounting to what culture is, right? And then the other piece to it is also taking a step back. And this is an exercise that I'll do with a lot of my hiring managers as we're looking to recruit, is figuring out how to define your culture. And a lot of times they're like, oh, our culture, we're very open to change and like we're disrupting and like innovative, and all those things are, important, but every company will have a distinct culture. And a good way to understand what that is when no one's looking, how do we act? When no one is over my shoulder or assessing something for me, like what are my default behaviors? and what are the things that are true about our company that might not be written out. So our unspoken norms. And I studied sociology in undergrad, so I love talking about norms and culture and all that good stuff. But I feel like it's really important to be able to articulate that because it'll give us a better idea of what that culture is. So that's more on the qualitative side. I would say on the quantitative side, we have all the different surveys that now exist. And oftentimes it can actually be really overwhelming because there's so many free resources and there's many paid resources that you can go to collect these feedback forms. But at the most basic level, I love setting up a quick form of what should we start doing? What should we stop doing? What should we keep doing? Those three questions will typically elicit some really good responses that then you can sift through and think through, okay, what are the pieces of our culture that we want to stay? And then what are the pieces of our culture that, we may need to really take a closer look at to either support or to be able to build out.
Yeah. I mean, I love that. I think that's so important, that listening, asking those open-ended questions, and really thinking about how you're creating those intentional connections through one-on-ones, through your actions. And then I like your definition of company culture in terms of how are people acting. Also, when nobody is watching, you can say you have these company values on the virtual kitchen wall or actual kitchen wall, but are people really living them out? How are you feeling? And the only way to figure that out is to continue to ask people as well. In terms of company culture, I know every organization is different, but I think I see kind of that common thread of really successful organizations actively listen. I would love to ask both of your opinion on how you see employee feedback management as a really important tool to continually, again, build that culture of listening at really thriving organizations.
Yeah, we get asked so frequently to implement design performance review processes individually for our clients. And then we also have clients that are like, I just want a platform, like make it easy for me. My favorite processes are the simplest. And I think the biggest missing piece in tech companies is upward feedback. So I'm most interested in how you are doing as a manager. That is actually where the gaps happen, where I lose my people. If I'm your HR person, retention really depends on those managers and how well they communicate, how well they support, how well they listen. To your point, so I want that feedback. And typically, companies and founders are just looking for a quick fix, is what we see quite often. And so they just want a structure in place. We want to be able to tell the employees kind of what they're not doing correctly. Obviously, just as important to support them in what they are doing well and then prompt them down their career path about what they have to look forward to in terms of operationalizing the areas that might be a little weaker for them. So first of all, I would just say we really need managers to be, I mean, most managers in tech also have almost no experience managing people. So a lot of the things that happen are happening just purely out of inexperience and without the ability to have feedback. That's just going to continue.
Yeah.
So,
and per that point too, I think a big part of what we typically will see is let's just get a platform on here and then that will change things. And yes, a platform can be really helpful. And we also need to make sure that we're also shifting behaviors. And I think that's the part where when we're meeting with folks one-on-one, when we're talking through like, okay, like not just platform and implementation and adoption, but we're thinking through what are the behaviors that are going to enable me and what's going to enable my team to be successful in setting goals, in following through with our goals, in measuring progress. And that's the fun part, really. But that's also the hardest part because you're like any behavior that you're trying to adopt is going to be tough, like a new workout, a new diet, whatever it may be. And so for work, you also need to have that accountability partner. And we end up being the accountability partners for many of our clients to make sure that all of those different pieces around goal setting, culture building, et cetera, are able to be built out.
yeah, and I would say super quick, the companies that lead with hiring a recruiter rather than an HR person or an operations person that knows how to do this work typically have a slower ramp up time in building out all these other processes to support the people they're bringing in. So if I could encourage founders to do both instead of delaying on the HR hire, that would be amazing.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think that feedback is definitely a gift. And whether it's one on one, individual to manager, or employee to company, the foundation of giving feedback, you need to have kind of your level set of intentions. Why are you doing this? You want to help you as an individual, help the company overall. And you have to have that level of trust, and that can never be taken for granted. That's something that we definitely believe in at All Voices as well, just continuing to build trust as an organization. In terms of human resources as a department or profession, I think we've seen kind of a shift in how people perceive the department. But I want to ask kind of your opinion on what is your advice for HR professionals to continually build trust internally?
Yeah, this is such an excellent question. So it's not easy. I think um, having a career like I've had where I've jumped around quite a bit, which used to be a negative thing, right? But in the tech, one of the things I love about tech is that you can move without being considered, a poor employee, but actually perhaps a more valuable employee if you're able to integrate more quickly and show immediate impact, which is what that kind of taught me to do. So I think back to my Nordstrom training, which was like you have 30 seconds to greet someone when they come into the department. I don't know if they still train this, but I used to do the new hire orientation trainings. And that always stuck with me. Also, in a lot of underrepresented cultures, greeting people is extremely important. You're acknowledging them, you're letting them know you see and hear them. So, if you think about like an HR process or a recruiting process, how are you engaging with your people? And then how are you being accessible to them? So the toughest thing for HR and tech and recruiting also is that we're usually so overwhelmed with work that doing another meeting feels like a weight on our shoulders. So keeping open space in your schedule that people can access on their own independently so they can book time. And then when you're with them, really make sure you've already pre-paved your energy and your emotion. Are you ready to listen to someone, or did you just get off a call where you're frustrated and angry? So I do really recommend meditating, not necessarily as a way of praying per se, but just as a way of quieting your mind, getting your morning space really well defined so it's not interrupted and you can kind of control how your day goes and how you're perceived and received by the people you're working with. So part of it is just, it's like everything else we're talking about. It's like getting data back from the people you talk to in real time. Is this approach working for this person? Because it's going to be very different per individual, right? Per culture. Or do I need to try another tactic? And always remembering that people are generally at work because they want to do well and they want to do their best work. So even if you're interpreting something as negative that they've done, having kind of a no judgment stance is always my policy. Like I may not understand all the details, I may only see one aspect of it. So I'm trying to go into that room with like a blank slate and I'm letting them talk me through what they're experiencing. So I know that's a little bit vague, but a combination of like having an open schedule, keeping an open mind, and making sure that you're taking care of yourself, because managing your own emotions is kind of the first way to be felt as accessible.
I'm like that. We should like promote it to everyone. Jabu is like a pro at this because all of that, it's so, so important. I think the only little tidbit that I would add is defining what HR means. I
Yeah.
think a lot of people typically they're like, oh, you're HR. That means that actually, what does that mean? So being able to define it is important, but everything that Jabu said, I like cannot stress enough. And I feel so grateful that I've taken a lot of advice from Jabu to take care of myself and be able to meditate and do all those things. And I know I'm better off for it. And I've gotten really great feedback from folks that I'm supporting because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it comes back to that common framework and expectations of defining what you mean by human resources, defining what you mean by inclusive recruiting practices, hiring, and kind of retention as well, what you mean by feedback, too. I think that's so important as well. We kind of talked about a little bit kind of the role of managers. Oftentimes, new managers especially, don't have any experience leading a team. And sometimes that could result in kind of ill equipped or ill resourced managers. And then that bubbles up into perhaps toxic managers. We've all heard this saying people don't leave organizations, they leave bad bosses or something of that nature. How can organizations,
Mhm.
especially in this kind of remote, virtual first world, in some cases, especially in technology, identify those hidden dangers of like misaligned values or goals and proactively find them by empowering employees to really speak up?
Yeah, this is tough because just as you know, you may have inexperienced managers, you may also have inexperienced employees, and then if you think about folks from underrepresented backgrounds, they may have less confidence raising their voice in a space where it's like, oh, we're all flat, everyone's equal here. So if you have something to say, please say it. So you know, it's really just paying attention, like who talks the most in your meetings. Um, you know, asking if it's not you, Christina, do you have anything to share? Those things are still can be intimidating, like they still are intimidating to me sometimes, but it just leaves space for everyone to be involved. And I think that's the CEO and the hiring manager's responsibility to be constantly keeping an eye on, like, is everyone involved here? Also being aware that everyone has different ways of processing. So what might be typical, like a typical way to move in a meeting room in a sort of Western or A type personality type, where you're confident about whatever you're saying, even if you don't know a lot about it. We see this a lot. But like maybe the person you're working with needs time to process. So you send them the information you're going to go over in the meeting ahead of time, let them process it for a day. So then when they come to the meeting, they're much more on firmer ground and they feel more confident about what they're going to say. It's just constantly like these are all forms of data that we get. And so as an HR person and a recruiter, we're always doing this. We're always looking at what works and what doesn't work. But I'd love to see that in the hands of our managers and our founders more often. And it will also serve them in every other aspect of their leadership and pitching and working with their boards. So there's just no end of reasons to kind of develop this muscle or ability.
Absolutely. And I would also add just getting clear on why. Why is this person a manager? Why is this person being promoted into a management role? Why do we need an additional manager or a manager, period? And getting to that why and having someone talk through that process is also an accountability measure, because oftentimes, you might be like, oh, actually, I don't know why. It just feels like the next step, but I
Yep.
don't have any evidence as to
Yeah.
why this person would be an excellent manager. But if you do ask that why and you literally write it down or type it out, that will help you at least get a ballpark of like, okay, like here are some of the skills that I see that this person has that would make them a great manager. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, like what are some gaps that this person might have in their management trajectory, or what are some gaps in terms of abilities or skills that they would need support with? And then how am I going to coach them? Or how can I find someone who's going to be able to coach them? And just again, the importance of being self-aware and reflective in that process, getting really clear on what that looks like is very, very important. When you're hiring, you'll hopefully will have some sort of rubric or a list of qualifications that you're looking for as you're interviewing. And when you're promoting, you should have some sort of list that you're looking at as well, or an idea of what skills, abilities, values you're really looking for in that potential manager. And that way you have some sort of guide as you're assessing that person's qualifications.
Mm-hmm. I think self-awareness is a really key, like the internal work of being a manager, and also asking yourselves these really reflective questions, and then understanding that most likely the people that you are managing, they're going to be very different, coming in with different lived experiences, different work experiences, and understanding how they want to receive, give feedback. Not everybody is going to be comfortable raising their hand in front of 100 of their coworkers and giving constructive feedback as well. And a lot of people are talking about this personalization at scale for employees who are in different locations and who are different parts of their career. And when we talk about employee engagement, what does that look like again in this kind of remote world? In your opinion, what does healthy employee engagement look like? How should we be redefining that?
Mm. Yeah, I think, you know, I've seen so many cultures that feel like if you show up and you're at the meeting and you appear engaged, that's kind of all that's required. And that does happen when you know, Lesley was talking about this, but you're just like, I'm one and done. We have this process in place, so let's just let it run. But if you're constantly editing and constantly iterating, constantly open to new ideas, hopefully that's a check against the bias that you might have internally. Like, I'm very A type, but I'm also introverted. So I can understand, and I'm almost never comfortable speaking out in large groups like that, even at this stage of my career. So I'm always really conscious of who might be like me at an earlier stage in my career where I really struggled to articulate what I was feeling or thinking. Um, but again, to your point, like people who don't have that sort of wider variety or more expansive variety of experiences, or it's pretty easy for them and their life has been pretty easy, have less of an ability typically to anticipate some of those things. It's just a muscle they haven't built because, quite frankly, they haven't needed to. So a lot of the things that we're talking about is one of the main reasons companies hire us, because we're talking about sort of almost aspirational qualities that we think companies and culture should have. And I suspect a lot of people watching this would be like, that is bananas. Like, I do not have time to do all of that. Like, I'm just trying to like keep the wheels on the bus. And so just knowing that there are teams and people who can support you in these areas where you might have gaps, you might have bias, you might not understand like how to evaluate engaged culture. And it might sound like I'm trying to bypass your question, but it's really just that it looks so different for so many different companies. And what looks like engagement at one company could just be a cover up for toxicity. Like, we see this all the time. And so is it performative? Is it real? Is it authentic? Hopefully you have an HR team that keeps you as a leader plugged into that if you're not able to, or a resource like us. But it's difficult to run the company, get the funding, do all the things you need to do, and do this. So I think just being compassionate also about leaders who struggle to do all the things, because that's a real burden. And for the new managers who are also very stressed out, wanting to do the right thing, but not knowing what that is, and maybe replicating toxic behaviors that they've experienced, right? We all do this despite our best efforts. So just making sure there's somebody in the room that is non-judgmental, but can point out and just say, hey, you're frequently interrupting Christina when she talks. I'm sure you're not aware of that, but I would love you to pull that back and make sure she has enough room to speak. Someone in the room.
Mhm.
Lesley.
Absolutely. And that always reminds me of when I was in the classroom, we would talk about differentiated learning all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Adapting the way that you're teaching based on someone's learning style, right? So if someone's going to be more kinesthetic learner, they're going to want to move around and move their bodies, whereas someone who might be more auditory might want to, be more of a listening ear. So Jabu and I actually are all constantly talking about that because we are very different, and even like working with each other, which then serves the way that we are able to work with our clients. For instance, I love typing all the things out, documentation galore. Like, I will write you documents left and right, all the notes. Meanwhile, Jabu's like, okay, you are inundating me with so many words. So what we did was we found a happy medium. So now we use video messaging to be able to talk to one another, give each other updates, which is a lot faster. And I still like my documentation, so I will still do my notes. But it's a way where we can really compromise and be able to work efficiently, but also being able to meet each other's learning needs and our styles and the way that we are able to absorb information. And I think about how if we were at, a company that was like employee engagement is documentation, right? We're like, okay, but we're missing out on all of this other goodness that we're able to create through our video messaging and collaboration that we're able to do through that, right? And so always thinking through how are we capturing engagement in different ways? But first and foremost, how are we defining engagement? What does that mean for our company? What does that mean for our department? What does that mean for our team? Because I feel like sometimes people assume that they're the same. Employee engagement will look the same for one company across every department and team, but that might not be the case. If you're looking at a sales team and an engineering team and an operations team, they're going to work very differently, and employee engagement will look very differently. So you always want to make sure that you're defining it and then figuring out, all right, how are we going to measure this? And what is data that we might miss out on because we're only focused on this specific subset that we're looking to measure. So always thinking through those pieces is really helpful. especially now that we're remote, we're, dealing with folks from all walks of life, global workforces. So it's really important to do that.
Yeah.
I like that example of the different kind of work styles and being able to adapt and have a conversation about meeting each other where the other person is and making it kind of effective and doable for both. I think over the past 2 years, we've seen a lot of adaptation, people being agile in their people practices, in the way that they're working too, which has been really kind of great. Is there an innovation that you're really excited to see in the realm of people and talent? I know some people are super jazzed about the 4-day work week, like me, or asynchronous work, real mental health benefits, supporting working parents and having that dialogue, the destigmatization of, talking about what's happening inside and outside of work. What are your thoughts there?
Oh, I love it. I've been trying to talk to CEOs for like the last decade on remote work, one, and working asynchronous. I don't closely manage my people. I find people that know how to get shit done, and I'm probably not supposed to swear, but that's
okay.
what I do. And I let them typically do their thing, and so we have these connection points where Lesley lets me know what she's doing, or Kenny or Emily, the other folks we work with, and then I let them run with their ball. And so I think it's getting out of the way, and if a 4-day work week works best for someone, I highly want you to do, I want you to do whatever gets me to the best work of your life, wherever I'm happy to work with you, right? And I think like we've just been a little bit too rigid about these things. This is again why I love the tech space. I really want to prompt CEOs and founders to be more creative, because they're still very trapped. Even the ones that have been forced to go into remote work by COVID, they're still like trying to set these sort of frameworks in a way that may or may not serve a working mom, to your point, or a student, or yada yada. So it's just, again, it's always starting from the employee experience instead of like trying to prescribe what it should look like, because you may or may not know. Now, I do want to say, like, some companies that are doing like fully remote, asynchronistic work and have very few touch bases, say, except maybe Slack, those are not also necessarily healthy places to work. So it doesn't mean that just because you've acquired some of this creativity and you've got a great PR team telling us about it, that it's working for employees either. So again, it's just, do you have someone in the room that can reflect back to you that this is working or not working, and how and why it isn't? And then how do we adjust? To Leslie's point, inclusion is really about looking at your company as a variety of different types of people, work styles, and cultures, individually and departmentally, divisionally. And so once you start this habit of looking at your own biases and constantly questioning them, you will have better end results for your culture, no matter what that ends up looking like. But a 4-day work week just makes sense. Like, why are we not doing that everywhere?
I know, Jabu, I feel like you're such a trendsetter, because so many of the things that years ago you're like advocating for, and people are like, that's wild, can't even imagine, now are so commonplace. And so it's really cool to be able to see that. I think for me, like a couple actually like tools that I'm really excited about. This is me nerding out on like productivity tools and all that. It's actually the video messaging stuff that we've been using within ourselves. And I've started using it with clients, especially clients who are on completely, time zones that were plus or minus 8 hours where I'm at, and I'm not able to meet them as frequently as I'd like. We still get to see each other and give each other updates and have a little bit more FaceTime. Also, just the openness for feedback that I've been noticing in the last few years, that's been really amazing, where folks are like, hey, we just got off that meeting, and they're doing this through like a Marco Polo video messaging or like a Loom or something. And they're like, hey, like, can you give me feedback? How did I do? Or like, how can I be better? Or, what did you think of that? Because it like felt, a little funny with me. And that openness to asking those questions, I think, is huge and is going to get us so far. So video messaging, openness to feedback. I also love the talk to text tools, because we're on our computers all day. I'm like, all of these wrists are going to be in so much pain. So those types of tools I'm really excited about too.
I love that. I am excited about all of it as well. I think that setting people up and providing the resources, the video messages you were talking about, and really asking people how they work best. I think a lot of people are talking about that results oriented kind of workplace too, in terms of, okay, if you need like, that 2 hour break in the middle of the day, you're not a morning person, you are really efficient at this time, really having those conversations as well. And especially people who are caretakers, people who are working parents, making sure that you're talking about these things as well. Jabu, Lesley, is there anything that I didn't ask that you both want to share with folks who are listening, or underscoring 1 to 2 key insights from the many things that we discussed?
Yes, I'd love to just say, and thank you. Um, there's so many different ways to be inclusive and diverse. And one of the ways we're really prompting and pushing our clients to do it is not only recruiting, but it's also through vendor and supplier diversity. And all of the vendors that we recommend to our clients are definitely from underrepresented backgrounds, and we make a point of doing that and a point of creating relationships with vendors that are excellent resources. But I think a lot of times companies default to whatever their investors tell them it works well. Investors are not typically a reliable source of information where diversity may be in mind. That's not always true. But just looking beyond, like, where does your money go? Where does the money go that your company is spending out in the world? Like, is your payroll woman owned, or is it a typical male dominated company? Is your recruiting firm all white, or have they also hired inclusively? If those companies aren't diverse, can they truly support you in a way that is inclusive?
Mhm. I'll chime in with two things. One, per that point around feedback, always asking someone for feedback is really important. Even if someone's like, oh, I don't know, I can't give you any feedback now, practice asking that. It's always really
Yes.
important to build that muscle. And it's only like the information you're going to get, you're able to then figure out what you're going to tweak, what you want to take, and what you might want to actually just toss. Right. So asking for feedback is a big one. And two, just for everyone listening, just thinking about how far you've come. And I think that's the
Yeah.
one metric that typically is forgotten, where we're like, oh, like I haven't hit my goals, I haven't done X, Y, and Z. But it's like, let's take a moment and actually look how far we've come in that distance traveled. And that part is also really important. And typically will give us the energy and that second win to get to the next step.
Absolutely. You have to celebrate the progress made so far and keep on keeping on, and that sustainable change over time. That's how you can't pour from an empty cup. And as we were talking about meditation, the self-awareness piece, understanding your energy level, what you're bringing into conversations, as well, is super important. Thank you both so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon, and for all of the work that you're both doing.
Yes,
Thank you
thank
so
you for
much,
having
Christina.
us.
Yeah.
Of course. And as a reminder for folks who are listening at All Voices, we really believe in that employee feedback management as a requirement for the organization to succeed overall. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.